This series is about Paul. We've been allowing Romans to shape our teaching year this year, and I kind of thought it would be neat to end our year with a little bit of an engagement with this character himself and thinking about Paul and his life, and how do we get to know that. So one of the things I'm sort of encouraging you to do during this series is maybe read about Paul's life as it's recorded in the book of Acts. So from kind of Acts chapter 9 onwards, you start to pick up this story of this character called Paul. Paul is probably second only to Jesus in importance to Christianity. Yet despite this, Paul's a kind of interesting character. He's not, well, let me put it like this. Like, everybody loves Jesus. Okay, now this is a fact of the world, right? Even people that don't believe in Jesus kind of know that they should love him. So, like, you talk to anybody anywhere, even people of different religions talk about Jesus. They talk positively about him. Oh, there's this Jesus. They don't necessarily believe what you might believe about him, but they go, oh yeah, this Jesus character. Like, I was in a bar the other day there talking to, goodness, that's probably not the right thing to say as a preacher, is it? So I wasn't in the bar. I was outside looking through the window at all of the sinners, and like that's bad. Like your first day back from vacation and you get fired. No, I was talking to a guy in a bar just the other day there, and our conversation was about Jesus. And it struck me as how interesting and how easy it was to talk about Jesus in a bar. This I find fascinating because all of my academic work in my life has been focused on Paul, right? So I wrote my doctorate on Paul, and I kind of am what you would maybe want to categorize as that's my field of research. Here's what I notice about Paul. Whereas everybody, not even Christians, not even Christians love Jesus, when it comes to Paul, this is what I notice, even Christians don't like him. You know, he's the second most important character probably in Christianity. 25% of the New Testament is written by Paul. And yet you kind of like it, kind of feels that nobody ever wants to say it, but people kind of think Paul was a bit of a jerk. And it's like, we don't really like that guy. In fact, somebody from Westside once said to one of the pastors, hey, that David guy seems to talk about Paul a lot. I don't get that. I like Jesus, but Paul, like, a little bit too grumpy for me. And maybe you've related to that at some point, that some people don't really like him too much. Maybe sometimes find him difficult to understand. Sometimes we just don't know what to think about him. One of the world's leading Paul scholars, however, offers this perspective on Paul, which I think is worth thinking about. Douglas Campbell, a New Zealand scholar based in the United States, says this: the Apostle Paul is the most influential political philosopher in the USA today, and arguably the rest of the world as well. And this surely makes him one of the most important figures in human history. He is not a contemporary philosopher, but he still exerts an unprecedented influence on current American culture and politics. This is quite an achievement when we consider that Paul lived 2,000 years ago and left a literary legacy of just a dozen letters or so, and one of them is very short. If you actually take all of Paul's letters and gather them together, you can read through them in a relatively committed evening. If you just sit down, get a decent latte, you can get your... one of my favorite scholars says this about Paul. He said, I never understand how Paul managed to write all of his letters without coffee, because I can't read them without coffee. But you can literally work through Paul in one evening. The world has 2.2 billion Christians, and most of them in the course of 1 week will encounter in their devotion of following Jesus some of the thoughts of Paul shaping them. But what we often fail to appreciate is that many of our notions that are considered sort of foundational to civilized society, ideas of liberty, equality, human rights, international law, these sort of ideas actually find their roots not in the Greco-Roman thinking that we often link them to, but actually in Paul's ideas that we find in these 13 letters and this book called Acts. That's quite something for a Jewish guy from a small town in the Eastern Mediterranean. How did this happen? How did this guy's ideas about a Jewish Messiah executed by the Romans in a far outpost of the empire, how did this guy's ideas about that change the world? Now, it's very easy to say, well, clearly Jesus is the most significant character in Christianity. Without Jesus, we don't have Christianity. But as you read Acts, you might want to ask yourself this question. Would we be sat here today as Christians were it not for Paul? Would early Christianity, would the disciples of Jesus have ever gotten round to getting their way across the Roman Empire in the same way that Paul did? Now, how that works out, and you might want to say, well, surely God would figure out a way to have this happen if it wasn't for the Paul. Admittedly so, but what you'll realize as you read Acts is the gospel reached Europe and spread its way around what we now call the world, because this guy called Paul took this transforming message of Jesus and traveled around the world on it, in a day when traveling around the world wasn't the easiest of things to do. Last week, Bob talked to us about Paul's conversion, about how Paul actually met Jesus. This incredible story that Paul recounts 3 times in the book of Acts. This story of how he encounters Jesus on the Damascus road, how his life is turned around by this meeting that he has. What's interesting is that when Paul tells his own story in Galatians chapter 1, you might want to notice just how subtly differently he frames it. In Galatians chapter 1 and verse 15, Paul says this, "But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his son in me so that I might preach him among the Gentiles." You see what Paul does there? The story we read in Acts talks about when Paul met Jesus. It talks about Paul on this Damascus road and this blinding encounter with the resurrected Christ. But Paul, once he's met that Jesus, realizes that the Damascus road may have been where he met Jesus, but Jesus met him considerably earlier than that. Echoing Jeremiah, Paul roots his life in a notion of purpose that precedes his birth. The purpose is that Paul would proclaim the gospel, the good news, the revelation, as Paul says in one of his other letters, that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself. One of the things I want you to do as you read the story of Paul is think about your own situation. Think about your own life and your own journey. And I find it profoundly shaping for us that Paul roots his purpose as something that precedes even him. Paul didn't catch God out. Paul wasn't born and then God thought, well, what are we going to do with him? Paul wasn't persecuting Christians and God thought, well, this guy's irritating. Let's see if he'll work for us instead of against us. Paul wasn't doing all of that stuff and catching God out. Paul's way of looking at his life is before I was even born, God had purpose for me. I find that profoundly shaping because as you read Paul's letters, what you realize is he doesn't think that's an isolated occurrence. It seems that Paul wants to suggest that all of us find our place in the heart of God before we're even born. So in those days when you stare in the mirror and feel purposeless, those days when you wonder what's even the point of being here, when things aren't going the way you want them to, or perhaps when things are going the way you want them to. This beautiful idea of Paul, constructed in his own testimony, is that God has purposed something for me before I was even born. I was set apart, Paul says. And this call that God would send him to preach among the Gentiles, by the way, this is massive for a young Jewish man deeply committed to the law. The idea that he would talk to non-Jews, the idea that he would tell them about the Messiah, that's not the way Paul thought his life was going to be. But so radically has this change of God happened, that the purpose that God had for Paul, that he was living out of sync with, when he comes into sync with that purpose, when his life is adjusted to be what God had purposed him to be, Paul now becomes passionately committed to moving around the known world and proclaiming this incredible story of Jesus. So we see this missionary risking life and limb, crossing mountains and seas, in the days when it wasn't easy to do that sort of thing, announcing this radical message of the gospel. There's so many stories of Paul in different parts of the world, and Acts seems to be showing you how Paul goes to all these different places with this message of the gospel, proclaiming the gospel in slightly different ways, always with the same core ideas in all of these different places. At the beginning of Acts, the gospel is limited to a handful of people in a small space in Jerusalem. And Acts ends with Paul on his way to Rome, the capital city of the world's biggest empire of its day, to proclaim the gospel. The change that this character makes because of a heart set absolutely on Jesus. And I want to pick up one particular story from Acts chapter 17 this morning, where we see Paul wrestle with this radical idea of the gospel in a really unfamiliar context. Paul finds himself in Athens. Athens at the time of Paul was the center of all thinking. Athens was where if you wanted to debate a philosophical idea, that was the place where all debate started. If you remember back to your kind of Greek classics that you may have engaged with at school, people like Aristotle, Socrates, Plato, they all find their roots in this sort of area of the world. They become the kind of core pin-up philosophers of those days. And Paul, this man from the backwater area of the empire, finds himself in Athens. Rome was the capital city of the empire. That's where the power, the politics, and the military were. But if you wanted to think thoughts, you went to Athens. While Paul was waiting for some of his friends in Athens, he was greatly distressed to see that the city was full of idols. So he reasoned in the synagogue with both Jews and God-fearing Greeks, as well as in the marketplace day by day with those who happened to be there. You see something of the passion of this guy right there. Where Paul is, he's arguing about the gospel. God set me apart from birth, he says, to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. That's as much definition as he needs. If he's in a synagogue, he's talking about Gentiles. If the people who are in this, he's talking about God, sorry. If he's in the synagogue and the people aren't even Jews, they're just God-fearers, a way of kind of talking about Greek people that were interested in Judaism. Yeah, he's talking to them about Jesus. In fact, if you send Paul to buy milk on the road to the market to get that milk, he will stop and talk to somebody about Jesus, which is probably a good reason not to send him to get milk, because he might not come back with your milk or your bread or whatever you sent him to. Because Paul was so committed that even in the marketplace, he's debating. A group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate him. Epicureans had a sort of perspective on God that God was very distant and far off and kind of uninvolved with life. So Paul's message would have interested them. Stoics believed that God was a lot closer, but kind of hard to kind of frame and express. So God was kind of in everything, but indefinable. This group of Epicurean and Stoic philosophers began to debate with them. Some of them asked, what is this babbler trying to say? That's not a kind of, when somebody calls you a babbler, they're not being complimentary. You know, that's a kind of like, what on earth is this dude on about? Like, it just didn't make a great deal of sense to us. Others remarked, he seems to be advocating foreign gods. Now, if you remember the story of Socrates, the great thinker at the base of Western philosophy, who was led to his death, the charge that caused the courts to push Socrates towards his death was that he was advocating foreign gods. So this little comment that they make about Paul, it suggests that there's a little bit of discomfort around Paul. They said this because Paul was preaching the good news about Jesus and the resurrection. It seems that they kind of misunderstood. The Greek word resurrection, anastasis, does sound like a girl's name. Some scholars think that because they say he seems to be advocating foreign gods, that some people thought that Paul was proclaiming two gods, Jesus and anastasis. They're not really connecting the idea that he was talking about the resurrection of Jesus. So they took him and brought him to a meeting of the Areopagus. The Areopagus was a stone kind of hill where all of the Greek philosophical debate of its time happened. If you had a good idea, that's where it was debated. There are two big hills that sat in this area. On invisible sight from the Areopagus is the Acropolis. Perhaps you've seen this, the famous sort of temple site. You can Google it if you're so interested. This famous temple site. They sat within vision of each other. On one hill, the site of worship of the various gods of Greece, and on another hill, the site of the philosophical ideas of what were going on. They said to him, may we know what is this new teaching that you are presenting? New ideas weren't always well liked in that world. Old ideas that had been tested and had tradition to them. New ideas, a little troubling. You are bringing some strange ideas to our ears, and we would like to know what they meant. All the Athenians and the foreigners who lived there spent their time doing nothing but talking about and listening to the latest ideas. So the Areopagus is kind of like the Twitter of the contemporary world. People spend a lot of time doing nothing but mostly talking. Paul then stood up in the meeting of the Areopagus and said, "People of Athens, I see that in every way you are very religious. For as I walked around, I looked carefully at your objects of worship, and I even found an altar with this inscription, 'To an unknown God.' So you are ignorant of the very thing you worship, and this is what I'm going to proclaim to you." Now, just a sidebar here. I realize that in my attempts to present to you Paul as a good guy, this doesn't really help when you realize that he kind of got up in front of people and said things like, "You're all ignorant," right? You're beginning to see maybe this is why people think he's a bit of a jerk sometimes, because like he hadn't read How to Make Friends and Influence People, you know? You're ignorant of the very thing you worship. The God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. Remember, they're in sight of a huge temple that still survives to this day. And he is not served by human hands as if he needed anything. Rather, he himself gives everyone life and breath and everything else. And from one man, he made all the nations that they should inhabit the whole earth. And he marked out their appointed times in history and the boundaries of their land. God did this so that they would seek him and perhaps reach out to him and find him, though he is not far from any of us. For in him we live and move and have our being. As some of your own poets have said, we are his offspring. Paul does something fascinating at this point. We're in the midst of this speech about God and what God is doing. He actually brings in a little piece of Greek philosophy. Greek poetry rather. The poet Aratus had written this incredible poem some centuries before. The poem was about the Greek god Zeus, later known by the Romans as the god Jupiter. This incredibly powerful god that was in the kind of top of the pantheon of gods and sustaining so much of the world. And Paul takes this line about Zeus, "In him we live and move and have our being," and says, actually, that line is about this God that I'm here to tell you about today. Now, it's become kind of trendy in recent times to talk about Paul's engagement with this particular text in a sort of way that, this is an example of Paul kind of just finding truth and identifying it wherever he sees it. And we kind of get this idea of Paul as this sort of kind of contemporary philosopher going around going, well, that's a bit of truth, and there we go, there's a bit of truth we hadn't realized before. But that's not actually what Paul's doing here. What Paul is actually doing here is pointing out that even though they seem to be saying things about Zeus that could be true, they're only true if they're said about Jesus. And so he takes this idea that is false, and by comparing it now to Jesus, the idea becomes true. Because Paul isn't on a quest to find truth wherever he can encounter it. Paul is driven by the truth that he has found in the resurrected Jesus. And he's out to correct and realign the world into that perspective. Therefore, Paul continues, since we are God's offspring, we should not think that the divine being is like gold or silver or stone, an image made by human design and skill. This is fascinating, by the way, because one of the strange things about early Judaism was their complete lack of idols. They didn't carve things out of stone or make things out of gold or fashion things out of wood. This was common in the religions of that time. What you would do is you would shape an idol of your God so that when you were in worship, you could look at that idol and be reminded of what your God was like. However, for Paul, deeply rooted as he was in the Jewish story of creation, he would remember this one line from creation regularly where the Lord God says, "Let us make man in our image." The reason Jewish temples didn't have idols in them is you only need to look as far as your neighbor to be reminded of God, because all of us are shaped in God's image. So Paul's idea of idols is always false, because whatever they carve out won't be God, and will direct our attention from those for whom God has called us to love, himself, and how we treat one another. In the past, Paul continues, God overlooked such ignorance, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. For he has set a day when he will judge the world with justice by the man he has appointed. He has given proof of this to everyone by raising him from the dead. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." Within sight of the temples of Greece, on the Areopagus, Paul offers a radical alternative way of thinking and living. What's fascinating is that Paul seems to know exactly what he's doing here. One of the ideas of the Areopagus was that ideas lived forever. Ideas lived longer than you. So in the legend around the creation of the Areopagus, the god Apollo inaugurated this space and blessed the space. And if you listen to the mythology that would have been well known in those days about the inauguration of this space, Apollos blesses the space of the Areopagus, blesses the space that ideas will live long, that philosophy will outlive the humans who even shape and create the philosophy. And at one point, a pronouncement is made by the god Apollos in the Greek myth, wherein he says this: when a man dies and his blood is spilled on the ground, there is no resurrection. And this was part of the mythology of the place upon which Paul stood and announced the resurrection of Jesus. The world that Paul is standing in denies the possibility of resurrection, and Paul firmly places it back on the table and says at the center of what this God is doing in the world is the resurrection of this man, Jesus. Because resurrection is at the radical idea at the heart of the gospel. Without the resurrection, you don't get a gospel in Paul's world. It's not just a nice conclusion to the Easter story. It's the fundamental piece that alters Paul's understanding of the world and also his understanding of God. But what I want to talk about this morning is something else that resurrection alters. And that's Paul's anthropology, Paul's view of the human. Because he would have been brought up with this understanding that God made humans in his image. But the resurrection of Jesus marks out clearly for Paul that humans are central to God's plan. God didn't just rescue Jesus' spirit. He didn't just rescue Jesus' soul. In a world that perhaps sometimes thinks that that's all religion is about, is spirits and souls, Paul doesn't think of a God who just rescued that. Standing in Athens, where it's all about what you think, Jesus isn't just an idea that lives beyond the grave, but for Paul, God emptied the tomb and took Jesus out and brought him to life again. And this changes for Paul how we perceive all humans. Because if God would bring life back to Jesus, it means that humanity is at the center of God's plan for the world. So for Paul, the Athenians are never going to make sense of philosophy. For Paul, you can't make sense of the world if you don't understand how important people are in the midst of that. Not just ideas, not just spirituality so that we can go be somewhere else, but this world and God's creation and you and me at the center of it. Because resurrection shows that God's interested in relationship. And Paul's anthropology would seem to suggest that you can't understand what it is to be human if you do it outside of the notion of a relationship with the God who raised Jesus from the dead. Resurrection is much bigger than just saving your soul. Resurrection is about God putting all things back together again. Susan Eastman, who wrote on the subject of Paul's anthropology, says it like this: Paul's anthropology takes its bearings from Christ, who enacts God's concern for humanity by taking on human flesh and blood for the redemption of all humanity. If you ever want to know the value of being human to God, it's that Jesus became flesh. That God was happy to be contained within human form. And so often in contemporary life, we speak so negatively about what it is to be human. But here at the center of Paul's idea, what I want to call Paul's resurrection anthropology, we find that every human has value. Resurrection anthropology locates the significance of the human in God's creation more than we'd ever thought before. Paul's writing in a Roman world where many, many humans had no value at all. If you were a slave in the Roman world, and the Roman world at times was the majority of the people in the Roman world were actually slaves. But slaves had zero value. You could do what you like with them, treat them as a piece of property. Women had very, very little value in the Roman world. In fact, if you look carefully, you'll notice that the primary and almost singular value of women in the Roman world that Jesus lived in and Paul lived in, the singular value of women was that they could give birth to sons. Not children, but sons. And Paul comes into this world with an anthropology based on the resurrection that says everybody has value, and that value is before God. This is kind of the basis of contemporary human rights. The basis of our UN Declaration of Human Rights, for example, is that ultimately all humans have certain equalities that should be afforded to them. That idea didn't originate in the courts of Greece. That idea didn't develop out of the philosophy of the Greco-Roman thinkers. That idea develops out of the notion of Paul and his resurrection. The resurrection and the value that it proclaims on everyone was completely out of sync with the world that Paul lives in. And I want to suggest simply this, that that's the lens through which you have to understand Paul's life and all of his letters. That the resurrection of Jesus changes everything, beginning with how we see and understand ourselves. So Paul's notion of self, perhaps even contemporary notions of identity, find their roots in this gospel idea that people matter to God. I want to simply throw out three things that perhaps we can hang our thoughts on regarding that. As you read Paul in Acts and as you read Paul's letters, I hope you'll detect these three things that you see constantly that are resurrection anthropology, a view of humans found by looking at the resurrected Jesus, seems to work its way like this. To begin with, I want to say it like this. For Paul, the past doesn't define the future. The fascinating backstory of Paul standing in Athens proclaiming the resurrection is that when we first meet Paul, as you encountered him last week, he is persecuting Christians because of their proclamation of the resurrection. He is about, when you first meet him, he is about the furthest thing from a preacher of the resurrection that you can find. He is aggressively destroying people who proclaim that. And fascinatingly, Paul sees that all of that backstory becomes irrelevant once he meets Jesus. Let me say this. I think that retrospect is perhaps one of the most debilitating features of being human. The ability to look back at your own life and think about it in particular ways can be one of the most debilitating things in our lives. Have you noticed how easy it is to do? To just all of a sudden, think about this. How much time in your life have you spent thinking about things that happened? I don't want a show of hands. You find yourself sometimes driving in the car, having a nice day, and all of a sudden you're thinking about something that was said to you yesterday or last week or last year, or sometimes as far back as like primary school, you find yourself thinking about something that happened or something that was said. Do you understand? Is this just me? Should I find some help? You notice how little tiny things trigger you and you start thinking about the past in particular ways. But often I notice this, how often those thoughts aren't the positive ones, they're the negative ones. Man, if only I'd done that better, if I'd said that differently. The guilt that I carry about something that I did or something that I said. Or what about the energy that I expend thinking about things that I could have made a better job of if I could have one more go. Or the time I give to wondering how my life might have been if I'd just done things differently. I'm not going to give you a visible example of this, but it's almost as if we moonwalk our way through lives. You know, we're kind of heading this way but looking that way. And we're constantly thinking about everything that's gone on in this past that we can't change while we back our way into a future that doesn't appear to be visible to us. And for Paul, what he seems to want to suggest is that all of that stuff there doesn't need to have a bearing on your future. Paul's speaking in a world where if you were born a slave, you died a slave. There wasn't a lot of option to change things that you'd done in your past. And to be truthful, that's often the way it's perceived in the contemporary world as well. The mistakes you make start to define your future. And this incredible notion of the resurrection says, even if your story takes you to death, don't think that that doesn't mean God can't do something. Jesus was in a tomb with a spear hole in his side, having been crucified by the Romans. The Roman governor put a seal on the tomb that said nobody is allowed in or out of this tomb. And the resurrection that God brought to Jesus didn't seem to see any of that as important. So when we think about our own lives and our own past, we often had a tendency to think nostalgically about what could have been or what might have been or what was. And we allow that to shape our future. But the past doesn't need to do that. The great Christian thinker from the last century, Leslie Newbegin, said this: nostalgia for the past and fear for the future are equally out of place for the Christian. Because if God has raised Jesus from the dead, then everything's different. The way we think about our lives, the way we process our situations are different. And think about this. What nostalgia often does, it starts to look back at the past and think about what is and what might have been. And often we do this subtly limiting thing where we imagine that if we just made better choices, if we just done things differently, then perhaps God would be able to do better things with us now. And what Paul's life seems to want to suggest is that even if you were aggressively set on destroying the church, that doesn't rule you out from being God's greatest missionary to announce the power of this gospel. So if God can take someone who is destroying the church and say, hey, how about you spread the gospel around the world? Paul would seem to be saying to us that in your view of what it is to be human, don't locate God only in the better choices, because God can work in you in the present for the future, regardless of what your choices were in the past. Following this, I see this in Paul. The circumstance doesn't define attitude. You'll notice when you read Paul in his letters, or you read Luke in Acts tell you about Paul, he spent a lot of time in prison, which again, I realize might not endear you to like him. You go, well, you know what I mean? If I was a jerk like him, I'd probably be in prison a lot too. He seems to get himself in a lot of trouble all the time. And most of his letters, he seems to be in prison. Paul doesn't seem to be hugely bothered by this. It seems quite strange. He seems to just roll with it. In fact, he seems to see being in prison as an opportunity sometimes. Read the letter to the Philippians. The letter to the Philippians is one of Paul's most joyful letters. This is despite the fact that he tells us that he's chained to a Roman soldier while writing it. In fact, Paul's perspective on being chained to a Roman soldier is that this soldier, therefore, is a captive audience for the gospel. You know, like what kind of crazy world is that to live in? Like, you expect Paul's letter to the Philippians to be, well, I'm chained to this guy. He could kill me at any moment. It's really bad. Send help. But instead, Paul's letter says, and God has given me opportunity to the gospel. The poor soldier turns up thinking his job is to guard a guy from the day. And Paul says, well, you're here all day. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Paul doesn't allow his circumstance to define his attitude. He allows Jesus to shape his attitude. So whether it's difficult journeys, whether it's opposition, exclusion, riots, trials, beatings, threats of execution, shipwrecks, Paul was stoned, and that doesn't mean what it means today. It means people throwing bricks at your head. Paul was stoned on an occasion and left for dead, and yet still his attitude is defined by the Jesus that God raised from the dead. I love Bishop Tom Wright's quote when he says, wherever Paul went, there was a riot. Wherever I go, they serve tea. Something has changed in being a Christian over the years, that actually where Paul went, there was always trouble, but now it's kind of become socially acceptable, which makes it hard for us to sometimes relate to what Paul's life was like. Later in the letter to the Philippians, Paul frames it like this, in perhaps some of the most stunning words that we can read in our contemporary life. I have learned to be content, whatever the circumstances, he says in Philippians 4. I know what it is to be in need, and I know what it is to have plenty. I have learned the secret of being content in any and every situation, whether well-fed or hungry, whether living in plenty or in want. I can do all this through him who gives me strength. The secret to being content is knowing your value before God, which is if you are a human, God raised Jesus from the dead because he has a plan and a purpose that was set out for you before you were even born. So if you're wealthy and comfortable or poor and not, Paul's saying the secret isn't found in your circumstance. It's found in knowing who it is that has rescued you and saved you. So he anchors his life in the resurrected Jesus. And this radical idea has major ramifications for how he lives. All these letters that we read of Paul, these world-changing, philosophical, adjusting letters, most of them are written from prison under the threat of death. You read Acts to the end, the story just cuts off. Paul arrives in Rome. What happens next? We don't actually know for sure, but Christian tradition tells us that Paul and members of his party were executed by the Romans shortly afterwards. And yet, despite all of this, Paul heads to Rome knowing that God has called him to proclaim the gospel there. What might the world be like today if Paul's circumstances did define his attitude? Imagine if Romans was just a book of depressing thoughts about what it's like to be arrested for Jesus. Imagine if Philippians was just a letter going, well, you think you've got it bad. Wait till I tell you my story. Imagine if Philemon, this beautiful letter about freedom from slavery was, what's the point in freeing slaves? We're all going to prison anyway. But we detect, in fact, if you aren't told it, it's often easy to read Paul's letter and assume that he's writing it from the comfortable space of his own library in his basement. Which makes me want to ask myself the question, what might my world be like if I stopped allowing my circumstances to affect my attitude? Because I think Paul has changed the world because all of these letters he leaves behind are defined by Jesus and not by his circumstance. But so often in my own day-to-day life, my circumstance defines my attitude. Finally, I noticed this with Paul. Context doesn't define perspective. Paul walks into Athens and proclaims the resurrection, which puts him completely out of sync with his society. Resurrection dislocates you. Resurrection sets you outside of the notions of normality. When we start to talk, whether it was then or now, about a God who raised Jesus from the dead, let's just be aware of the fact that's an unusual thing to say. And Christians have often forgotten this and assumed that to be Christian means that you're going to fit in the world, that the world's going to be agreeable to you. So much of Christian contemporary debate in the present is based around the notion that Christians are becoming surprised that it's actually sometimes hard to be a Christian in the contemporary world. If Paul was to come here and preach, which is a statement, right? If Paul was to come here and preach, like most preachers are nervous about the notion of Jesus turning up to preach because we all know that if Jesus came to preach, you would never ask us to come back. But Paul once preached for so long that a guy fell asleep, fell out the window and died, right? So most preachers are also confident that were Paul to come and preach, we'd be asked back quickly. But if Paul was to come and preach for us today, I think he would find our notions of Christianity confusing. I think some of the protections that we assume, some of the things that we perceive to be just obvious rights that we as Christians have, Paul would say, where did you get the idea that the world would give that to you? We proclaim the resurrection of Jesus. It's a strange and unfamiliar idea. Perhaps Paul might say to us, stop expecting to fit in easily. Your ideas are going to put you out of sync. Your perspectives on things are going to knock you out of line. Perhaps your principles will make you feel awkward in the world. So is our context in the church today, is our view on things shaped by the spirit of the age, the zeitgeist that we live in, or is it shaped by the resurrection of Jesus? And let's be careful what we mean by that. Because we say the resurrection of Jesus, we don't say Christian tradition or the way things have always been. Because I think this is true. In recent years, the church has become weak on some really important issues. There are issues that we've kind of become a bit not straightforward on, that perhaps the resurrection isn't defining so much. There's issues that the church is starting to just kind of sound a little bit like everybody else on. I'm not going to define what those things are. I'll let you consider them yourself. But let me just say this as well. The church has also become very strong on certain things that don't actually find their basis in resurrection. There's things that we've fought for and defended and said are deeply, deeply important to us that actually, if we're honest, are not as doctrinally and theologically important as perhaps we might think. And what the resurrection does, a resurrection that places the human in this prime position in God's plan to save the world, the resurrection might call us to pick up things that we have dropped, to say that thing that we said didn't matter, maybe it does matter. But it might also call us for some things just to leave them behind, to put them down and say, do you know what? We fought for that, but it wasn't actually as central to the story as we thought. Let me go back to where we started, but one verse earlier. In Galatians 1 verse 13, Paul says, "For you have heard of my previous way of life in Judaism, how intensely I persecuted the church of God and tried to destroy it. I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age and among my people, and was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers." Paul was quintessentially fitting in. He was exactly what he was supposed to be. He was excelling in his context in the way that he should. And then he says this, "But when God, who set me apart from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me." Paul's previous life was defined by his context, but the revelation of Jesus changed everything. And if you read Paul, you see that. His views on slavery are completely out of sync with his world. His views on women are completely out of sync with his world. In a world that locates women at the very bottom of free people, Paul has women leading churches. Paul has women apostles. Paul has women prophets. Paul has all of these sort of notions going on, which fascinates me because so often in contemporary context, we see Paul as being this kind of anti-female character, but quite the opposite if you actually read him. Instead, what you find is a person whose anthropology is shaped by the resurrected gospel of Jesus. That be you a slave, a Jew or a Greek, male or female, you're brought into this equality of relationship with God. Because God has radically changed Paul's life by the gospel. Which makes me want to ask this question quite simply. What is the radical idea of "but when God"? Paul's life was doing one particular thing, and then he encounters Jesus. But when God. It's the question of Athens. It's the question of Paul's life. It's the question of the gospel. What difference does the resurrected idea of Jesus make? This radical notion that God has changed the world by raising his Son from the dead. So is our past defining our future? Is our circumstance defining our attitude? Or is our context defining our perspective? Or, like Paul, has the resurrected Jesus changed our life so that we really do say, in him and only him do we live and move and have our being?